In August 2019, the global news cycle exploded with what sounded like a punchline. The United States wanted to buy Greenland. The headline was ridiculed as absurd, a diplomatic blunder, or the fantasy of a real estate mogul. But inside the Pentagon and the intelligence community, nobody was laughing. This wasn't a sudden impulse, it was a recurring strategic obsession. In 1946, President Harry Truman secretly offered Denmark $100 million in gold bars for the territory, and the State Department had already drafted the transfer treaty. This begs the question, why does the world's leading superpower have a 70-year fixation on a frozen rock with a population smaller than a single football stadium? The answer lies in a specific distortion of reality. If you look at a standard map, Greenland sits harmlessly in the upper periphery, isolated and irrelevant. But strategic command centers do not look at wall maps, they look at polar projections. When you view the Earth from the top down, the geography of paranoia reveals itself. Greenland isn't east or west, it is the direct, shortest straight line between Moscow and Washington, D.C. For a Soviet bomber pilot in 1950 or a Russian ICM trajectory today, Greenland is the gateway to the American heartland. The attempts to buy this island were never about acquiring land, they were about acquiring the ultimate surveillance platform. Washington wasn't trying to buy territory, they were trying to buy early warning time to close the deadliest blind spot in the Western Hemisphere. The lengths intelligence agencies went to secure this ice sheet are staggering. The story involves broken international laws, lost thermonuclear weapons, and the declassified reality of Project Iceworm, a secret city built entirely inside a living glacier designed to launch hundreds of missiles before the enemy even knew the war had started. If you want to understand the files that politicians don't read and the operation's history tries to bury, make sure you are subscribed. We are about to uncover the intelligence reality beneath the ice. It began on April 9, 1940. Nazi boots hit the cobblestones of Copenhagen, and within hours, Denmark surrendered. This created a massive legal black hole in the North Atlantic. Greenland, a Danish colony, was technically orphaned. In Washington, the Danish ambassador, Henrik Kaufmann, did something unprecedented. As described by historian Bo Lidegaard in Defiant Diplomacy, Kaufmann declared himself the independent representative of a free Greenland, ignoring orders from his occupied government. He effectively went rogue because he understood the intelligence reality. Greenland was the geographical pivot of the Atlantic. On the surface, the American interest was meteorological. Intelligence planners knew that weather systems moved from west to east. If you controlled the weather stations in Greenland, you could predict the storms over Europe. This data would eventually be the deciding factor for the D-Day landings. But deep in the industrial intelligence files, there was a far more critical resource at stake, one that rarely makes it into high school history books: cryolite. At the time, the Ivitut mine in southwest Greenland was the only commercially viable source of natural cryolite on Earth. This mineral was the solvent used in the Hall-Héroult process to refine aluminum. The logic was terrifyingly simple. Without Greenland's cryolite, you cannot smelt aluminum at scale. Without aluminum, you cannot build the fuselage of a B-17 bomber or a P-51 Mustang. The Germans knew this, and the US couldn't risk sabotage. According to records from the Coast Guard Historian's Office regarding the Greenland Patrol, the US moved fast. Even before officially entering the war, the Coast Guard launched the South Greenland Survey, a polite diplomatic cover name for a military expedition to secure the mine. By April 1941, Kaufmann signed an agreement granting the US basing rights, defying Copenhagen to save the colony. There is a persistent myth that the US ignored Greenland until the Cold War nuclear age. The record shows the opposite. Before the first American soldier landed in Europe, intelligence services had already identified Greenland as the single point of failure for Allied aircraft production. They weren't just buying safety, they were locking down the raw materials required for total war, setting a precedent for American presence that never really left. But as the dust settled on World War II, the map changed, literally. For centuries, military planners looked east and west across the oceans to spot threats. But in 1946, the Joint Chiefs of Staff looked up. They realized the world isn't a cylinder, it's a sphere. And over the top of that sphere lay the shortest route between the Soviet Union and the American industrial heartland. This geographical epiphany drove one of the boldest yet least remembered real estate bids in history. According to declassified records from the Department of State's 1946 files, specifically within Record Group 59 at the National Archives, Secretary of State James Burns made a formal, secret offer to Gustav Rasmussen, the Danish foreign minister. The United States wouldn't just guarantee safety, they wanted the deed. The offer was $100 million, and to be clear, this wasn't credit or foreign aid. Burns offered $100 million in gold bars. Why such a desperate, tangible offer in 1946, a time when most Americans just wanted peace? The answer lies in a specific Joint Chiefs of Staff assessment found in the Foreign Relations of the United States volume for that year. The intelligence community had concluded that the next war wouldn't be naval, it would be aerial. Long-range bombers turned the Arctic from a frozen barrier into America's vulnerable front door. If the Soviets developed the atomic bomb, which intelligence estimates correctly predicted was imminent, Greenland would instantly become the most valuable piece of geography on Earth for early warning and interception. Without it, the US was blind. While the diplomats negotiated, the military didn't wait. This is where we hit the darker part of the iceberg. Hidden within the logistics reports was the groundwork for what would later evolve into Operation Blue Jay. The U.S. began quietly staging construction materials and surveying sites under the guise of minor weather research and extending existing wartime agreements. They were effectively building the logistical skeleton of a massive base, Thule, before the Danish government had fully agreed to or even understood the sheer scale of the project. Ultimately, the purchase failed. Rasmussen was reportedly shocked, knowing that selling an entire country's territory would be political suicide. Nationalism trumped the gold. But the intelligence assessment held firm. If Washington couldn't own the land, they needed the rights. This led to a unique, tense compromise: defense without ownership. The U.S. wouldn't buy the island, but they would force a treaty that allowed them to treat the ice as a fortress, setting the stage for a secret nuclear game that Denmark never signed up for. That secret game began in the summer of 1951 with Operation Blue Jay. In total silence, the U.S. Navy transported enough steel and concrete to build a small city, establishing Thule Air Base on the island's northwest coast. Publicly, Thule was a logistics hub and a radar station, part of the ballistic missile early warning system designed to spot Soviet bombers crossing the Arctic. It was a defensive shield. But as the 1950s progressed, intelligence assessments shifted rapidly. The threat profile moved from slow-moving bombers to intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the strategic doctrine changed from simple defense to second-strike capability. The Pentagon realized that fixed silos in North Dakota were sitting ducks for Soviet targeting. They needed a weapon system that was invisible and constantly moving. This necessity birthed one of the most audacious engineering projects of the Cold War, Camp Century. Constructed in 1959, The Army presented it to the world as a city under the ice, a harmless research station where scientists studied polar survival and ice core samples. To power this remote outpost, they installed the PM-2A, a portable nuclear reactor. It was a triumph of public relations. Newsreels showed American soldiers living comfortably in trenches carved beneath the surface, protected from the brutal elements. But according to declassified U.S. Army Corps of Engineers reports and extensive analysis by the Danish Institute for International Studies, the science was merely a cover for the site's true purpose. Camp Century was the pilot program for a top-secret initiative known as Project Iceworm. The scale of Iceworm was merely science fiction. The Army planned to carve a massive network of 2,500 miles of tunnels within the Greenland ice sheet. Inside this frozen labyrinth, they intended to deploy 600 Iceman nuclear missiles, modified Minuteman ICBMs mounted on railway cars. From an intelligence perspective, the logic was flawless. The emerging discipline of satellite imagery intelligence, or IMINT, was becoming the primary way superpowers tracked each other's arsenals. Soviet satellites could easily photograph a missile silo in the American Midwest, but they could not see through 2 miles of dense glacial ice. If the missiles were constantly shuttling through the tunnels, the Soviet Union could never target them. Greenland was effectively being turned into a land-based nuclear submarine, an undetectable launch platform within striking distance of Moscow. However, the operation failed because military intelligence underestimated the environment. Glaciologists initially advised that the ice was stable, but the sheer mass of the glacier was viscoelastic. It was moving. By 1962, the tunnels began to deform. The trenches narrowed, the railway tracks twisted, and the ceiling of the reactor room dropped inches every month. The base was being slowly crushed by the ice sheet. Realizing the engineering was impossible, the Army abandoned Project Iceworm in 1966. Yet the deception lingered. As historians Henry Nielsen and Knudsen document, the U.S. government never informed Denmark, which held sovereignty over the island, that the base was a proof of concept for a nuclear launch complex. This was a direct violation of Denmark's nuclear-free zone policy. When the U.S. evacuated, they removed the reactor core, but left the infrastructure, the biological waste, and low-level radioactive coolant behind, operating on the assumption that the accumulating snow would entomb the secret forever. But the assumption that the ice would keep quiet was a gamble the Pentagon eventually lost. While the Army was buried in waste at Camp Century, the Air Force was running Operation Chrome Dome, keeping nuclear-armed B-52 bombers in the air 24 hours a day, looping constantly over the Greenland ice sheet to stay within striking distance of Moscow. On January 21, 1968, that luck ran out. A B-52 carrying 4 hydrogen bombs caught fire mid-air. The crew bailed out, and the bomber slammed into the sea ice of North Star Bay, just miles from Thule Air Base. The conventional explosives inside the weapons detonated on impact. They didn't trigger a nuclear yield, but they shattered the bomb casings, scattering radioactive plutonium across the ice in a disaster that forced the United States and Denmark into a frantic diplomatic corner. The crash didn't just break the ice, it broke the cover story. The wreckage proved physically that despite Denmark's strict nuclear-free zone policy, the Americans had been flying live thermonuclear weapons through Danish airspace for years. A comprehensive 2009 report commissioned by the Danish Institute for International Studies, or DIIS, utilized declassified archives to reconstruct the aftermath. It revealed that while the public saw a cleanup operation codenamed Project Crested Ice, the intelligence community was managing a much darker crisis, the fear of a missing weapon.
For decades, conspiracy theories circulated that one of the 4 bombs associated with serial number 78252 had melted through the ice and was never recovered, potentially lying intact on the seabed. However, that same 2009 DIIS investigation, which cross-referenced newer underwater surveys with the original 1968 debris logs, concluded that the missing bomb narrative was a myth. The weapon hadn't vanished, it had simply been obliterated into thousands of unrecognizable fragments upon impact. The intelligence assessment was clear. There was no loose nuke, only a diplomatic radioactive stain that forced a renegotiation of how the US used the island. As the 1970s approached, the strategic value of Greenland shifted again. The age of the slow-moving bomber was ending, replaced by the age of the intercontinental ballistic missile. Thule Air Base stopped being just a refueling point and became the ultimate electronic eye. The Pentagon installed the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, or BMES, a massive phased array radar complex designed to stare unblinkingly over the North Pole. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Arctic strategy and want to see how other frozen frontiers shaped global intelligence, make sure to check the Geopolitics of Ice playlist linked in the description right after this video. This radar installation became the single most critical asset in the American nuclear shield. In the event of a Soviet first strike, the missiles would fly over the Arctic. Thule was the only sensor capable of detecting them early enough to give the US president a 15-minute warning to launch a counterstrike. Without Greenland, Washington would be blind until the warheads were already re-entering the atmosphere. This reality solidified a new intelligence axiom. The US didn't need to own the land to station troops anymore. It needed the land to see the sky. Danish Institute for International Studies. The Greenland Thule Crash, Denmark's Nuclear Reality, 2009. Comprehensive report on the crash, the missing bomb myth, and US-Danish nuclear relations. US Air Force, Project Crested Ice, the Thule Accident, Declassified Accident Report, January 21, 1968. Official USAF count of the B-52 crash and subsequent cleanup. Nautilus Institute, U.S. Nuclear Weapons in Denmark, Hans M. Christensen. Detailed analysis of the semi-secret nuclear umbrella. They weren't just looking for oil, they were looking for logistics. The threat vector became visible in a case study that reads like a suspense novel. It centers on Gronadal, a forgotten, abandoned naval base in southern Greenland. By 2016, the Danish government planned to demolish the facility to save money. It was a rust bucket. But then, a distinct offer appeared. The General Nice Group, a Hong Kong-based conglomerate with murky ties to the Chinese state, offered to buy the base intact. Intelligence analysts at the Pentagon suddenly realized the implication. A Chinese-owned port facility would sit inside the North American defensive perimeter, capable of servicing research vessels that, as noted by the outcome of the 2019 Department of Defense China Military Power Report, often double as signals intelligence collectors for the People's Liberation Army. This wasn't a theoretical exercise. The purchase was moving forward. It triggered an immediate, quiet panic in Washington. The realization was stark. The US had thousands of troops at Thule to stop missiles, but zero legal mechanism to stop a commercial real estate transaction. As reported by Reuters and later detailed in the Financial Times, this forced a frantic diplomatic intervention. The US effectively pressured Denmark to cancel the sale and keep the base, purely to deny it to Beijing. And this was just the prologue. The General Nice Group attempt was a probe. The real escalation came when the Greenlandic government, desperate for economic independence, sought funding for 3 massive international airports. When Western banks said no due to credit risks, a Chinese state bank said yes.
This brings us to the moment Defense Secretary Jim Mattis had to intervene personally. In Washington's view, this was debt trap diplomacy, the same strategy seen in Sri Lanka and Djibouti. If Greenland defaulted on the loans, Chinese state entities could legally seize control of dual-use airstrips capable of handling heavy military transport aircraft. The quiet melt was over. The checkbook war had begun. These reports were the smoke. The fire became visible in August 2019 when President Donald Trump shocked the global press corps by suggesting the United States should purchase Greenland. The media narrative was instantaneous and dismissive. This was treated as an absurd, anachronistic real estate fantasy, a tycoon trying to buy a country like a golf course. But inside the intelligence community, the laughter was notably absent. While the delivery was unconventional, the strategic logic aligned perfectly with classified assessments circulating in the Pentagon. The proposal wasn't a real estate deal, it was a clumsily phrased geopolitical ultimatum, driven by a terrifying new variable in the Arctic equation, the collapse of warning time. For 60 years, Thule Air Base was designed to look up and north, watching for high-altitude ballistic trajectories. But the threat landscape described in the Congressional Research Service's ongoing series, Great Power Competition in the Arctic, had fundamentally shifted. Russian military doctrine was moving toward hypersonic glide vehicles, weapons that don't fly in a predictable high arc like traditional ICBMs. They fly lower, faster, and can maneuver mid-flight. The old radar horizon at Thule was designed for the physics of the Cold War. Against low-flying hypersonics, the curvature of the Earth creates a blind spot. If the United States loses access to Greenland's geography, or if a hostile power establishes a foothold there to jam or compromise those forward sensors, the American missile defense shield goes blind until the warheads are already over Canada. This urgency is compounded by the Space Force angle. Thule is no longer just looking for missiles. It is a critical node for the 12th Space Warning Squadron, tasked with space domain awareness. As the Pentagon tracks the proliferation of killer satellites and orbital weapons from rival powers, the polar view from Thule is irreplaceable for tracking objects in polar orbits. Losing the island politically means losing the eyes of the United States in the Northern Hemisphere. This brings us to the sovereign trap, a concept that intelligence analysts have watched develop in Nuuk for a decade. Greenland's government has been explicit about its desire for full independence from Denmark, but independence is expensive. The island relies on a massive annual block grant from Copenhagen to keep the lights on. To break free, Greenland needs a new revenue stream. This created a dangerous opening. Chinese state-owned enterprises offered that revenue stream in the form of airport expansions and mining infrastructure. The intelligence reality of 2019 was stark. If Greenland declared independence using Chinese loans to replace Danish grants, Nuuk would effectively become a debtor state to Beijing. A Chinese creditor could then demand dual-use access to ports and airfields, placing PLA sensors or logistics hubs mere miles from Thule Air Base. The United States realized it was facing a checkmate scenario, where it could be evicted from the Arctic not by war, but by a sovereign debt default. Consequently, while the purchase offer was rejected, the United States immediately pivoted to a strategy of soft acquisition. It is buying the island's loyalty, if not its land. In April 2020, the U.S. Department of State announced a historic shift, the reopening of a U.S. consulate in Nuuk for the first time since 1953. This was followed by a $12.1 million aid package explicitly designed to integrate Greenland's economy with North America. The objective, stripped of diplomatic language, is to crowd out Chinese capital. By becoming the primary economic partner and underwriter of Greenland's development, Washington is executing a soft kill of Chinese influence, ensuring that when Nuuk looks for a partner, they see the stars and stripes rather than the red star. The United States is buying Greenland, dollar by dollar, aid package by aid package, to ensure the Arctic remains an American lake. Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA. Challenges to Security in Space, 2019-2022. Ultimately, when you strip away the diplomatic awkwardness of the purchase offer, the intelligence reality reveals a continuity that has existed since 1941. The headlines focused on the absurdity of buying a semi-autonomous territory, but the Pentagon's logic was consistent with 80 years of strategic anxiety. We have traced the evolution of this anxiety through the documents. It began with simple weather stations, where the only intelligence value was predicting if a storm would sink a convoy. It escalated to the bomber age, where Thule Air Base became the only runway close enough to strike into the Soviet interior and return. It went underground with Project Iceworm, a failed attempt to turn the ice cap itself into a nuclear silo. And now, as the DIA reports indicate, it has transformed into a contest for the raw materials of the digital age and the radar eyes needed to spot hypersonic threats. The United States did not try to buy Greenland for its real estate value. It tried to buy it because Greenland is effectively the cork in the Arctic bottle. As the polar ice caps recede, the Arctic Ocean is transforming from a frozen barrier into a navigable sea, creating new shipping lanes that bypass the traditional choke points of the Suez and Panama Canals. Intelligence estimates from both the Danish Defense Intelligence Service and the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence suggest that whoever holds the infrastructure in Greenland holds the keys to the North Atlantic. If a strategic competitor, whether it is Russia refurbishing its Soviet-era Arctic bases or China pushing its Polar Silk Road initiative through mining investments, establishes a foothold here, the security architecture of the Western Hemisphere collapses. The GIUK gap, that critical naval choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, would no longer be a barrier to Russian submarines, but a gateway. The final intelligence reality is a lesson in perspective. The greatest deception in geopolitics often comes from the map hanging on the wall. On a standard Mercator projection, Greenland appears as a distorted, peripheral mass at the top of the frame, a frozen wasteland at the edge of the world. But intelligence planners and ballistic missile guidance systems do not use flat maps, they use globes. And when you look at the Earth from the top down, centering on the North Pole, the reality shifts instantly. From this vantage point, Greenland is not at the edge, it is the absolute center. It is the massive geographic wedge separating the Eurasian landmass from North America. It sits directly under the shortest flight path for intercontinental ballistic missiles, and it overlooks the most critical maritime approaches to the United States. The purchase offer was a clumsy diplomatic move, but the strategic calculation behind it was precise. The ice is melting, the northern front is opening, and the silent war to control the high north has already begun. To understand the specific naval mechanics of that choke point I mentioned, and why Russian submarines are testing these waters more aggressively than at any time since the Cold War, you should watch our deep dive on the GIUK gap and modern submarine warfare right here. It explains the underwater game of cat and mouse happening right now. A full list of the declassified documents, reports, and historical texts used to build this timeline is available in the description below.